Hi, I'm Bonz, Magsambol, and you're watching Rappler Talk. A World Bank report showed that 9 in 10 Filipino students aged 10 are struggling to read a simple text. How is the government addressing the learning crisis in the Philippines? Today, we are joined by Senator Sherwin Gatchalian, Chairman of the Senate Committee on Basic Education. Hi, Senator. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Bonz.
How has it been a year into the Marcos administration, Senator?
Sorry?
How has it been a year into the Marcos administration?
You mean in terms of education or in general?
In general, sir, kumusta kaya yung unang taon ni President Marcos?
So far, so good. And I think the thrust of the administration is to increase investments in our country and increase our growth so that we can outgrow some of the fiscal problems that we are encountering, such as debt and such as high spending. So far, from the data that I've seen, pledges for FDI has risen to about 120%. Of course, these are pledges. It's yet to be seen in actuality, but that's a good sign that the president has managed to put the Philippines back on the investment map. And the challenge here is to sustain that, especially sustain our credit rating, because the credit rating is what investors are looking at in terms of economic health and in terms of investment climate.
Sir, let's go now to the education issues now, since you're the chairman of the Senate Committee on Basic Education. So on Tuesday, August 29, schools will welcome millions of basic education students for the new school year for academic 2023-2024. This, as the Department of Education, of course, reported that the country lacks 159,000 classrooms. This is a perennial problem. It almost doubled from last year's 91,000. How do you think the government should address this issue?
We cannot address this issue, Bonds, with business as usual solutions. And you're correct, no, that this is a perennial problem. It's been a problem for a long time. And to date, the DepEd will need approximately 140,000 new classrooms just to catch on the growth of our student population. If you equate that to peso value, that's about 400 billion pesos, more or less. No? So just to compare, the allocation in this year, 2023, the government only allocated close to about 10 billion pesos for new classrooms. So it's far cry from the 400 billion required. So that's why we're seeing a lot of 2 shifts, 3 shifts set up here in the urban areas. There's a caveat to that. If you look at the system-wide student-to-classroom ratio, it's about 40 students to 1. So meaning in the rural areas, for example, in the provinces, they're not experiencing overcrowded classrooms. In fact, some of them will have only 20 students per classroom, the others 30. But here in the urban areas, no? For example, in Valenzuela, I know for a fact that some of our senior high school classrooms is reaching about 60 students per classroom. So there's massive congestion here in the urban areas. And the solution to that is, let's think outside of the box. One of the recommendations that I made during the hearing is, let's expand the senior high school voucher system. And the senior high school voucher system, it has 2 benefits. No? Number 1 is to decongest our public schools. And then number 2, giving the power of choice to our parents to where they will want to send their children to school.
Okay. Actually, Senator, during that Senate hearing, one of the recommendations that the private schools suggested, aside from, of course, expanding the senior high school voucher program, is like pahihiram daw nila, of course, yung facilities nila or sa public schools. Like, for example, of course, we all know that private schools have like adequate facilities in terms of classrooms. Ito ba ay isang solusyon na tinitingnan, of course, ng government?
When we were looking at the data, public school student enrollment is now beyond pre-pandemic level. It grew approximately about 4 to 5%. But if you look at the private school enrollment, it went down to about 14 to 15%, no, pre-pandemic level. So meaning there is excess capacity in our private schools because the students, because of probably the pandemic, some of them are still encountering financial difficulty, move to the public schools. So we can use that excess capacity in private schools by diverting some of our students there. So we can the voucher system in effect will give the students the ability to choose where they want to study. For example, if a private school there will have excess capacity, they can use the voucher system to go to that private school. So that's one of the solutions. No? But I told them that let's study the economics, no? Which is more expensive, giving vouchers or building classrooms.
building
So it's a
classrooms,
simple computation, but we requested DepEd to run the economics so we will know which one is the most economical for government.
Okay. Senator, actually, ito nga, nabanggit natin kanina na 159,000 classrooms and doble siya from last year's na 91,000. So parang nakikita natin, dumodoble siya every year, each year. So, during the budget, of course, budget season na ngayon, so meron ba kayong makikita na pwedeng i-realign sa budget ng Department of Education para, of course, mabawasan natin itong mga classrooms na kakulangan natin?
Actually, if you will target 400 billion, I'm sure it's impossible.
Yeah.
400 billion is a lot of money. And just before I answer that, maybe our viewers would want to understand why we constantly have shortage of classroom. Number one is student population is growing at around 4 to 5%. There's a natural tendency there's a natural growth of student population in our public schools. And we all know that our population is growing. So in a growing population, you'll have kids or you have learners going to school. Number two, because of calamities. And we all know that our country is a perennial path of typhoons. And every time there's typhoons or even volcanic eruption or earthquakes, you will need new classroom because the old classroom will get damaged. And number three is the natural wear and tear of classrooms. We live in an archipelagic country, and the schools near the coastal area will experience the wear and tear because it's beside seaside, and they get rusted, and they experience both the hot and then also the blow of the wind. So those three reasons why we constantly need new classrooms. And it's very difficult. I have to honestly, I admit that it's very difficult to raise 400 billion. But what also I actually recommended before is we can also tap the funds of the local governments in terms of building classrooms. I remember during the Aquino administration, they had a good program. It's called the counterparting program, wherein national government will give one classroom, but local government will give one more classroom. So in effect, we build two classrooms. When I was a mayor, I find that effective because it's an incentive for local governments to build more classrooms.
Okay. So on K-12, actually the promise of K-12 remains a promise up to this day. So, di ba, yung promise niya talaga is to make our senior high school graduates employable by the time they graduate grade 12, right? So you said that this promise of the law was unfulfilled. What do you think went wrong?
Yeah, there are three tracks, no, or three directions the K-12 was envisioned. Number one, they will be college ready. Number two, they will be work ready. And then number three, to be entrepreneurs. No? So there are three exits for senior high school students. I'll talk about the work readiness. No? And to date, a lot of the private companies, even government, would want to hire college graduates instead of senior high school graduates. And if you look at the statistics that PIDS generated, yes, it's true that they are being hired. It's true. But the salaries that they are getting is not much more compared to the old 4-year system of high school. So in other words, we added 2 years in senior high school, but the salary is not far better than the four-year system of high school. The numbers will show that they are being hired, but the problem also the quality of that job, no, the quality of jobs that we are giving our senior high school. I remember almost 30 to 40% are considered very menial or very simple jobs. No? So in other words, we added 2 years of schooling, but they end up working in very simple jobs, no, such as car wash or utility responsibilities or utility personnel. And that's not the equivalent of the 2 years that we added. No? So we need to analyze that, improve on the senior high school so that they will improve their employability in high-paying jobs, and at the same time they can land decent jobs if they start looking for employment.
Okay, how do you think we can improve this curriculum? Of course, the Department of Education recently launched its Matatag K-10 curriculum. So, ano sa tingin nyo yung kulang na kailangan pa nating idagdag dito sa curriculum na to? At ano yung sa tingin nyo na reforms para ngayon nga ma-fulfill natin yung promise nitong K-12? Kasi di ba parang yung scrapping nitong K-12 curriculum is not a good option at this point in time because we already invested in the education like technology, facilities, and materials.
Where there are simple low-hanging fruits that we can use to improve the favorability of senior high school and therefore improve the employability of our senior high school graduates. One of the things that came out during the EDCO meeting is our senior high school students who take the TechVoc track. That's about 400,000 senior high school students. That's close to about 30 to 40% of our senior high school students. After taking 2 years of TechVoc, they are not given the equivalent certification, no? Assessment and certification. So they end up having nothing. No? So after 2 years of taking TechVoc, they're not certified. And we all know that if you go out and look for a job, the first thing that our employers will look for if you are a TechVoc graduate is your certification. So the senators agreed to fund that next year. We don't need a new law. But a new law will be a much more desirable direction so that there's institutionality. But next year, we will fund the assessment and certification of our senior high school graduates so that when they graduate, they'll have two documents. One is their diploma, and then the second is their certification. And they can use their certification to look for a job in their community, especially the TechVoc track is designed to be employable within your community.
Okay, I see. On a related topic, since school opening na ulit this coming Tuesday, ito din yung naging point of discussion during the last Senate hearing, yung pagre-revert nung class opening natin to June because as we all know, recent events showed na may mga estudyante na dinala sa hospital because na-dehydrate sila because of the heat. For my question to you on this topic, what do you think are the pros and cons of reverting the school opening to June?
Well, the good thing, no, the good thing, Bonz, we've experienced summer break and what I call now the rainy season break, no, because the break is in between rainy seasons, no, and there are pros and cons. You're right, there are pros and cons to this. Now, for example, if the break is during summer and school year will start June, we experience a lot of school cancellations because of typhoons. Now that the break is during the rainy season, we don't have a lot of school cancellations because there's no classes, but we experience a lot of extreme heat. And in our hearing, we invited Pag-asa, and Pag-asa made a very accurate and very thorough presentation. They actually showed us the pros and cons. And my main takeaway there is we are now experiencing much hotter summers. And Pag-asa told us that the heat index is actually going up over the past few years. No? So if we have classes during summer, students will feel this increase in extreme heat. And that's also quite, of course, dangerous for their health, not only for our students, but also for our teachers, especially in the urban areas, because they have to they have to go to school throughout the day. That's number one. And for me, what actually disappeared is the time of our students to socialize, to spend time with their family, to grow as a child. Traditionally, time immemorial, our breaks are during the summer, no? And that's the time where kids go out and play with their peers. They spend time with their family, and normally families go out on summer breaks, especially Holy Week. But now, because we don't have that, our learners spend less time with their families, and during the rainy season, they cannot go out and play with their peers. So there's also the developmental factor that we have to look at, and that's why I recommended to slowly go back to our original traditional summer break, because nasanay na tayo dyan no? The summer break, and um, we all grew up with that summer break, and our family time revolves around that summer break, no? And it's also important to look at the holistic growth of the child, not only in academics, but spending time with family and friends. That's why we recommended to slowly go back to the summer break.
Okay. Senator, actually yung isa din dito na sinasuggest, of course, ng mga education groups and advocates is, di ba, meron tayong blended learning. Pero hindi kasi siya institutionalized. Of course, nasa discretion pa rin ng isang school if i-implement nila to. Pero nakikita ba to na isang solusyon para, of course, hindi tayo magpabalik-balik na, di ba, babalik ulit tayo sa June and then mainit, 'di ba? Mainit yung yun yung problema natin, sobrang init. And then bumalik naman tayo, maulan naman, so mabaha. Nakikita ba natin na institutionalize na natin tong blended learning para in times ng mga ganito, 'di ba? Students can just like learn from their homes.
Yeah. Well, one thing positive or one good thing that we learned from the pandemic is the use of the internet in education. And during the pandemic, the education tried very hard to go blended learning. Of course, in the private schools, those who are in the upper echelon of our society, those who can afford constant internet, have the laptops and the gadgets, they can do blended learning. But wow, close to about 90% of our students go to our public schools, no? And if you look at the pie of our public schools, almost 60-70% don't have constant internet connection, especially the poorer segment of our learners. So what was exposed in the blended learning modality is the digital divide between those who have internet connectivity and those who do not have internet connectivity. And those who do not have internet connectivity got left behind. So yes, I do agree that the future of education is blended learning. We have to strive to do that. We have to build the foundations, for example, internet connectivity in our schools. But we cannot do it right now, tomorrow, or next week. No, that will take time because internet connectivity still remains as a dream for many of our poor constituents. And even they have the money, no, even they have the funds, there's no connectivity in some of our islands, no. And if there are connectivity, it's not constant, and it's not conducive for blended learning if the internet connectivity is not smooth and constant. So it will take time, in other words.
Okay, days prior to the school opening, of course, Vice President and Education Secretary Sara Duterte issued an order na tanggalin natin yung mga decorations sa classrooms. Kasi sabi niya, she wants the students to focus on the teaching. Do you agree with her directive na kailangan nating i-clear yung classrooms natin with like these decorations, with this like informational posters? Do you agree with her?
Well, when I visit schools for example, in Valenzuela, when I visit schools, I do see a lot of things inside the classrooms, on the wall, outside of the classroom. I find it quite messy, no, because some of them have been put there for a long time. and normally I recommend to our principal, at least here in the principals, to make sure that our schools remain clean and neat, so that it's presentable to our parents and to our teachers. So that concept, I do agree. We need to make sure that our schools are clean all the time. We need to make sure that our schools are neat all the time. It's a presentation to our parents as well, no? So I think that order, if I understand it correctly, is to remind teachers to constantly make our schools presentable, no? Clean, presentable, and of course safe for our learners.
Okay. Pero as Senator, wala kasing nilabas or wala nagpapakita na study na ito ngang mga classrooms na wala na kahit anong even informational materials ay nakakatulong dito sa learnings ng mga estudyante natin. So, do you think kailangan talaga na kahit yung mga simpleng ABCD or kahit yung mga, lalo na sa mga primary schoolers natin, kailangan talaga siyang tanggalin?
But again, no, in understanding ko dyan is to make our schools neat and presentable.
Okay.
Of course, if it's preschool, you will need ABC, no? ABCD, 1, 2, 3. If it's kindergarten, you will need ABC. That's a common pedagogy being used by our teachers, no? So my understanding of that directive is to clean and to make our schools presentable. That's my understanding. It's not aimed to curtail the teaching style or the pedagogy of our teachers.
Okay. For my next question, the Department of Education is again seeking for 150 million in confidential funds for its 2024 budget. This drew public criticism as the mandate of the agency is clearly not related to national security. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, before I answer that, there are mechanisms to make sure that these confidential funds are spent wisely. Number one, it has to be approved by the president, and it has to have certain description on where those funds will be used. And then number two, those funds are subject to oversight of Congress, and those funds are also, number three, is subject to audit of COA. And from what I understand from the statements of the Department of Education, those funds are aimed to address drugs, violence, peace and order issues in some of our areas. And admittedly, in some of the areas, like for example, in the urban areas, we still have drug issues. No? For example, drug dealing in school, drug uses in school. And we will also have issues of violence, for example, recruitment by insurgencies in the provinces. So my understanding is there's a purpose for those those confidential funds. No? And what's important for me is we have to analyze how those funds are being used and if the objectives are being met by those funds. No? Especially those funds are meant to, like I said, no, are meant to make our schools peaceful.
Pero Senator, we're talking about like students, basic education students whose age are 5 years old, 6 years old until 12 or 14, 15, right? So parang 'di ba, parang may disconnect if we're like the intended yung intention talaga nitong confidential funds is for surveillance sa mga estudyante na nag-use ng drugs. So how do we parang hindi lang siya nagme-make sense na yung mga estudyante na nasa grade 1, grade 2 is may under surveillance because of drugs?
Well, you have to also bear in mind that we have senior high school students. These are 16, 17, 18. Some of them are even 19 years old. No? And my personal experience with this age group, they're susceptible to temptation and they're susceptible to drug addiction and to vices. I'll give you a very personal experience ko. Marijuana dealing. That's very prevalent in our senior high school classes. In fact, I remember when I was a mayor, that was a serious issue in our schools because the target of these drug dealers are senior high school because ang bentahe nila marijuana is organic and therefore you can use it, no? And it's harmless. So that's a clear and present danger. The other one is gang violence. Again, we experienced that in Valenzuela, and we had to address gang violence also in our schools. Gang violence, fraternity violence, these are also real problems that our schools are encountering. Okay, but what I'm saying is these problems are real, no, and it's happening in our schools. And but the most important point is we have to make sure that the confidential funds that are allocated here is designed to help make our schools peaceful, make our schools violence free, and we want to make sure also that those funds are used in order to remove all of these bad elements in our schools, and that's what we want to look at, especially now during the budget season. I think this is the time to scrutinize every single usage of the funds.
Okay, Senator, just to give you then a clear a situation. Like, of course, the Philippine Coast Guard is allocated only 10 million pesos in confidential funds in the 2024 budget, whereas the Department of Education is allocated 150 million for its confi funds. So, hindi ba parang may disconnect na bibigyan natin yung DepEd, which is like clearly, yung mandate niya is for education reforms ng 150 million, whereas yung PCG na yung mandate niya is to defend, lalo na nga, di ba yung recent Chinese incursion sa West Philippine Sea, bibigyan lang natin ng 10 million. What is your position on this?
Well, I don't know the reason why the Coast Guard requested such a small amount. I'm not very sure. No, we'll probably scrutinize that during the budget hearing. Okay. But my opinion, they should receive more. Okay. For example, if the Coast Guard would want to build their intelligence network using their intelligence funds, or come up with a mechanism to gather information, we can use their confidential funds. So. It's really up to them. I'm not very sure how come they only requested for a small amount, but in my opinion, they should request for a big amount, and we're ready to support them.
Okay, on mandatory ROTC, you've been pushing or advocating for the return of mandatory ROTC in college. This despite public criticism that the government needs to focus on more urgent education problems. Like, of course, pinag-usapan natin kanina, meron tayong 159,000 nakakulangan sa classrooms. Why is this so?
Well, the public opinion actually supports it. If you look at the Pulse Asia survey, almost 70%, majority of the population wants to bring back ROTC. It's not my figment of imagination, but it was a scientific survey that was undertaken to get public opinion. And more than 70% would want to bring it back. No? And the reason for that, if you ask that 70%, is discipline. They want to instill discipline among our youth. With discipline comes patriotism and nationalism. And that's the driving force while most of our constituents, 70% of them, want to bring back ROTC, including myself. Of course, in education, there's so many things that we have to look at. No, the best case scenario is we solve all of them at the same time. No, and that's what we're striving for. No, to include discipline, patriotism, the development also of readiness. That should also be at the same priority with the other education issues.
Okay. Senator, when you say na nagkaroon, of course, ng survey commissioned by your office, when you say stakeholders, this and that, who are you referring to exactly? Are the students really surveyed, or yung mga parents nila? Kasi the sentiments of the students online are really not reflective of the surveys commissioned by your office.
Yeah, if you look at that survey very carefully, those surveyed between 18 to 24 still said that they want to bring back ROTC. 70%, almost 70% of them. If you look at the Pulse Asia survey, segmented also by age. No? 18 to 24, 24 to 35, 35 to 45. And if you look at the school age children or school age youth, college age youth with age between 18 to 24, 70% of them would want to bring back ROTC. That's why it dispels the notion that the youth don't want ROTC. No? And again, no, I didn't invent that survey. You can contact Pulse Asia. You can request Pulse Asia to give you a briefing. But examine that survey very carefully. And I want to bear note that the 18 to 24 also supports the reinstatement of ROTC. So it's not only the adults.
Okay.
I mean, it's not only the group that is outside of college, but also the cohort that is in the college age group.
Okay. So this was a breaking news earlier. The Office of the Ombudsman ordered the preventive suspension of some government officials tagged in the overpriced laptop deal. So clearly, this is a problem on procurement. And actually, a Rappler investigation showed in May, this is another laptop issue. So I co-wrote the article with another Rappler reporter. Nakita namin na yung ibang laptops na intended for public school students were being sold in the Facebook marketplace, nasa mga store siya dito in Mandaluyong, Cebu. And then nakita namin doon, meron kami mga documents to prove na yun nga, may negligence and corruption on the part of the Department of Education, kaya ito nangyari. And then actually this story prompted the resignation of two Department of Education officials from their office. So parang napaulit-ulit kasi siya, Senator, na nangyayari. What are your recommendations to avoid a repetition of this? Kasi when I sent these actually story links to senators, they were silent about this. Wala kami narinig na parang magkakaroon ulit ng another investigation or titingnan tong issue na to. Ano sa tingin nyo yung recommendations nyo para hindi na mangyari itong ganitong corruption?
That's a good question. Well, the filing of the cases against these people is the offshoot of that investigation by the Blue Ribbon Committee, headed by Senator Tolentino. I was quite active, no, in that hearing, and we discovered that there's so many gaps in the procurement system of government, including the DepEd. I'll give you a very specific example. When they called for, when they sent out a letter to invite for bidding and offers, there was the letters were sent out to very few suppliers of laptop, and there's only one person who decided where to send it to. So meaning that person can actually favor suppliers to participate by sending those invitations to them, and also disenfranchise some suppliers by not sending the invitation to them. So that person holds so much power.
Okay.
And that is a gap, actually. And we discovered that there's no process or there's no method in selecting those suppliers. It's really just out of the sheer decision of that person to decide who to invite in order to get bids and to get offers. That is a gap that we need to plug. And along the way, I remember during the hearing, there are so many gaps that we need to plug. Admittedly, when I remember the head of PSDBM at that time, or head of the GPPB office, admitted that there are gaps and admitted that they need to plug those gaps, or else this type of violations will constantly occur in the procurement, not only of laptops, but other government purchases. No? And we need to use this lesson to improve the system. No? And I was surprised that only people from the rank and file level can make that decision. And they're given so much authority. It might look trivial, no? But they're given so much authority and decision in purchases that can amount to billions of pesos. And we need to tweak that process so that everything is recorded and people cannot abuse their power.
Okay. Senator, actually another thing, since you brought up about itong pagbibigay ng contracts na selected or pinipili ng iba na kahit hindi naman sila kayang i-deliver. Actually, the Rappler investigation also showed that the Department of Education favored these tiny logistic firms based in Las Piñas, which is Transpac. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Pero sila actually yung naningil kasi sa Department of Education Department of Education ng unsettled fees. So dahil hindi sila makabayad, dahil hindi binabayaran ng Department of Education, itong Transpac na to, yung mga subcontractors niya, hindi niya din mabigay, hindi niya mabayaran. So what happened here was, kaya dito nagkaroon ng reselling ng laptops. So ano sa tingin niyo yung concrete na plano or na dapat solusyon dito para maiwasan natin na nabibigyan ng favor itong mga ganitong maliliit or dahil kilala sila of course ng mga tao inside the government?
Yeah, I'm not very sure of that issue. Ngayon ko lang narinig yung issue
I
niya.
can send you, sir, the links later.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'll answer that on a macro and process basis. No, I mean in looking at the process. Again, we have to identify the gaps. How can this capitalized, unexperienced companies can join in and participate in a bid and be chosen to undertake very complex logistical endeavors, no? And that should not be the case. In fact, if you look at the procurement law, it's very strict. You have to have experience, you have to have capitalization, you have to have contracts with government of the same nature. But then again, you'll see this type of companies bidding, winning, and my first instinct there is there's probably collusion between insiders. No, so the first order is to look for those people who colluded, file cases against them. But on a long-term basis, we need to plug the gaps. No? We can keep on replacing people. We can keep on replacing the personalities there. But if they find that there are gaps, they will be tempted to abuse those gaps, and they will. And again, these problems will occur over and over again.
Sir, pero Senator, nakikita niyo na ba na isang solusyon dito, of course, is i-decentralize natin yung procurement? Like, let the division offices or the regional units procure kung ano talaga yung kailangan nila instead of like, binibigay natin sa central office itong ganito kalaking mga procurement.
Pros and cons yan, actually. I remember before, books are procured by the division. Lahat ng mga book suppliers will go to the SDS, the superintendent. And you know what happens when all the book suppliers goes to the superintendent. I remember that when I was a mayor, that was the system. So, but they took that back because we gave the SDS so much power to buy books. And you know, books is also a billion peso procurement. No? So we have to balance it. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Decentralization is efficient, it's fast, no, it's more responsive. But then again, we need to make sure that it's not abused because we're talking about 220 plus divisions, 17 regions, and you know, things can happen there also. No? So we need to balance it. No? We need to balance it.
Okay. On a different issue, Senator, you deny, of course, any involvement in your father's Manila Bay Reclamation Project. However, a mining website states that your brother, Kenneth, is a board director of the ALTAI mining in Sibuyan. Do you think these links of your family to these controversial projects is affecting your image and public trust in you as a public servant?
Well, I think you should answer. I think you should ask those personalities. Ever since I went into public service, I don't have any more connection with those activities, especially of our family. So it's better to ask them what are those activities.
Okay. In relation to that, Senator, how can you assure the public that your family's close ties with the Marcos administration has not unduly led to favors in connection to these projects?
Well, I think again you have to ask the family members because I'm not actively, I'm not involved in that in those activities.
Okay, so since we've been talking about the education issues, to wrap up our discussion, Senator, which education-related bills should be prioritized in this post-pandemic era?
Actually, marami. No? There are a lot of bills. There are actually 10 bills that the Education Commission endorsed. No? But throughout our discussions, we are discovering more and more things or more and more bills that we need to file in order to address basic issues in education. I'll give you a very specific example. Early childhood care and development. That's a priority bill that we filed in order to address gaps in the early childhood care and development delivery. Because that's if you look at the structure, ECCD is delivered by local government, but it's the policy is national government, and there's a gap in between. No? So we plan to address that. The other one is what we talked earlier about senior high school. We plan to also reform the senior high school delivery, especially on TechVoc. And number three, we also discovered that we need to create an independent assessment and evaluation body. Right now, DepEd creates the curriculum, it delivers the curriculum, it assesses itself, it makes recommendations to itself. No? So there's no check and balance between the delivery of the curriculum and the assessment. No? And in many advanced jurisdictions, these are separate. No? So we plan to file also a creation of an independent assessment body that will assess our learners, give recommendations to the DepEd, and to make sure that those recommendations are being followed.
Okay. So what should the public expect from Senator Sherwin Gatchalian in the next years?
Well, the next years, we're very focused on reforming our education system. As you know, we already convened the Education Commission 2, and we've been meeting for the last 1 year, almost twice, 3 times a week. And like I said, we already made recommendations on 10 important bills, but along the way, we're also making recommendations directly to the different education agencies. So our thrust is there, you know, and hopefully we can put the foundations in place to improve learner outcomes and to improve learner performance down the road. Of course, this is a long game. It will not happen immediately, but we want to put the foundation so that maybe down the road, 10 years, maybe even more, we'll see improved learner outcomes.
Okay, so that's Senator Sherwin Gatchalian. Thank you, Senator, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more stories, go to Rappler.com or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Again, I'm Bonz Magsambol. Thanks for tuning in.